Youth overcoming hardship in a land of immigrants. Rachel's family arrived in California in the early 1960s, wide-eyed and hopeful, chasing the glimmering promise of the American dream. They came with almost nothing, just a few suitcases, a handful of memories from their homeland, and an unshakable belief that, in America, hard work could lead to a better life. The land of opportunity, they thought, would welcome them with open arms. But what they found was something entirely different. It was like stepping into a completely different world, Rachel would later recall. Back home we were poor, but at least there was a sense of familiarity. Over here we didn't even have the comfort of knowing the language. Everything seemed foreign, and everyone seemed like they had everything figured out, except us. The family rented a cramped apartment in a deteriorating neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The paint on the walls was peeling and the ceiling leaked every time it rained. Their kitchen was barely big enough to fit one person, and Rachel and her 3 siblings shared a bedroom barely larger than a closet. Rachel's father, a skilled carpenter back home, could only find work as a handyman, taking on odd jobs when he was lucky enough to find them. Her mother, once a teacher, worked long hours cleaning houses for wealthy families in upscale neighborhoods. She would come home with her hands blistered and smelling like bleach, but she would always muster a smile for us. It was like her way of telling us, "This is temporary, we'll get through it," Rachel remembered. Despite their struggles, Rachel's parents never let her see the full weight of their burden. But Rachel noticed how the bills piled up on the kitchen counter, how the grocery trips became more frugal with each passing month, and how her father's shoulders seemed to droop a little more every time he walked through the door. School was supposed to be her refuge, but even there, life was hard. As one of the few children of immigrants in her predominantly white school, Rachel often felt like an outsider. Her name was mispronounced, her lunch of homemade tamales was met with confused stares, and her halting English made her a target for teasing. "I hated raising my hand in class," she admitted. "The words would always come out wrong and the other kids would laugh. After a while I just stopped trying." Even so, Rachel refused to give up. She would come home every night, sit at the rickety wooden table in their living room, and pore over her textbooks. Her parents' whispered conversations in the background serving as a reminder of why she needed to work hard. "I had to make it count. I wanted to show them that everything they were sacrificing wasn't in vain." But beyond the academic challenges, there was the hardship of adolescence compounded by poverty. Rachel dreamt of things her classmates seemed to take for granted: a pair of shiny new shoes, a dress that wasn't secondhand, a proper birthday cake. Her family simply couldn't afford luxuries. For her 16th birthday, her parents pooled enough to buy her a used bicycle. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and Rachel rode it with pride. On weekends, Rachel worked with her mother, helping clean houses. It was hard, physical labor, scrubbing floors, wiping windows, laundering sheets. But Rachel found unexpected lessons in those long days. She saw the stark contrast between her world and the marble kitchens and manicured lawns of the families they worked for. It lit a fire in her. "I kept telling myself, one day, I'll have a house like this. Not because it's handed to me, but because I'll earn it." There were moments of darkness too, moments when doubt began to creep in. Would anything ever change? Did the American dream even exist for families like hers? But every time Rachel felt like slipping into despair, something would happen to reignite her determination. A neighbor gifting them groceries during a tough week, a teacher taking the time to praise her writing, or a quiet moment of solidarity with her father on the porch as he shared stories of the struggles he'd overcome back home. "We weren't rich, we weren't even comfortable, but we had each other," Rachel said. "That's what made it bearable. It wasn't easy, but we learned to appreciate the little victories: a passing grade, a warm meal, a roof that didn't leak too badly. We learned how to laugh even when everything in us wanted to cry." Rachel's youth wasn't defined by comfort, but by resilience, grit, and an unyielding belief that better days lay ahead. What she didn't realize then was that those struggles were shaping her into the woman she would one day need to become, a woman capable of surviving loss, heartbreak, and setbacks, but never falling apart. It was in those formative years, in that rundown apartment and through those endless sacrifices, that Rachel learned how to fight, how to dream, and how to rise above the hardships that life threw her way. The fateful encounter. Rachel never saw love coming. It found her on an ordinary afternoon in an even more ordinary place. At the time, she was juggling her responsibilities and worries, dutifully helping her mother clean houses on weekdays and running errands on weekends. It was on one of those weekends in the corner of a small family-owned grocery store that her life subtly but profoundly began to change. The air smelled of freshly ground coffee and overripe bananas as she pushed an old squeaky shopping cart, carefully ticking off a meager list of essentials: rice, beans, flour, and a little sugar if they could afford it. Rachel always tried to save the little change she had for her siblings' sweets, but deep down, she longed to spend just once on something truly for herself. Yet her responsibilities didn't allow for whims. On the other side of the aisle stood Matt. He was stocking tins of canned soup on neat shelves, his hands moving like he'd done this 1,000 times. He wore a faded denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt, the sleeves slightly rolled up, exposing his strong, tanned forearms. His dark, slightly unruly hair framed a youthful face, kind, open, and lined with just enough tiredness to suggest he understood hardship as much as she did. His brows furrowed in concentration as he carefully aligned the cans, but his brown eyes held a softness that contrasted with the manual rigor of his work. Rachel wasn't looking at him, at least not initially. She was focused on picking the smallest, lightest bag of flour, a deliberate calculation in case the price at checkout exceeded her budget, but it was his voice that pulled her attention. "Careful, that bag's leaking. I'd grab this one," Matt said, motioning to a sturdier sack of flour on the second shelf. His voice was warm, tinged with sincerity, with no trace of mockery or impatience. In that moment, the world tipped off its axis for Rachel just a little. "Oh, thanks," Rachel replied softly, trying not to meet his eyes but failing. When she glanced up, she noticed him, really noticed him, for the first time. The way his lips curved into a hint of a smile, how his eyes crinkled at the corners, as though he found joy even in the smallest of exchanges. "No problem," Matt said, stepping back to give her space. He hesitated for a moment as though he wanted to say more but wasn't sure he should. "I'm Matt, by the way. You live around here? I think I've seen you before, but maybe I'm wrong." His hands stuffed awkwardly into his pockets now, a rare pause in his otherwise confident demeanor. Rachel felt her cheeks flush. No one had ever cared to ask her name before, especially not with genuine interest. Rachel, yeah, I'm usually in and out quickly. Too busy to stick around," she said, clutching the flour to her chest like it was a shield. "I get that. Busy's the story of my life too," he chuckled. "But hey," he added, nodding towards her cart, "your list looks like you're practical. A lot of folks don't know how to stretch a dollar like you seem to." She laughed nervously, unsure whether to take it as a compliment or a pitying observation. "Well, that's what happens when you don't have a choice, right?" There it was, honesty laid bare without shame. And instead of making Rachel feel small or sorry for herself, Matt gave her a small nod of understanding as if to say, "Yeah, me too." From then on, their conversation flowed as naturally as the day itself. Matt shared stories about his job at the store, his love for fixing things, how he was saving up for night classes in construction management. Rachel, for reasons she couldn't explain, let her guard down and told him about her own daily struggles, the work she took on with her mom, her younger siblings who depended on her, and her quiet dreams of finishing school someday. "It's not much, but it's mine," Matt said, gesturing toward the rows of meticulously stocked shelves. "Just like your family's everything to you. That's how I feel about the work I do. One day, though, I'm going to build something better. Something that lasts." Something about the way he said it struck Rachel. His determination mirrored her own, but there was also something more: hope. A quiet yet steadfast hope sitting alongside the struggles. It surprised her, and maybe it scared her a little too. She had buried her own optimism long ago beneath layers of exhaustion and obligation. After that day, Rachel's shopping trips became a little less rushed. She wouldn't admit it openly, not even to herself, but she began to look forward to catching glimpses of Matt in the aisle, his presence unexpectedly soothing even through short exchanges. Matt, for his part, found reasons to extend their conversations. Whenever Rachel walked in, he became a little more attentive, curious to learn her preferences, her quirks, her ambitions. When Rachel's cart squeaked too loudly, he'd chuckle and ask, "Still haven't replaced that thing, huh?" and help her maneuver it over the uneven tile. It wasn't long before he worked up the courage to ask, "Hey Rachel, what would you think about going to the community dance this Friday? It's just down the street from here. They've got live music and pizza and, it's totally fine if you don't want to, but I'd really like it if you said yes." Rachel blinked, startled that someone would invite her anywhere, let alone to something as carefree as a dance. Pizza? Dancing? It felt like an entirely different world. But she saw the sincerity in his face, the absence of condescension or pressure, and decided to take a chance on something bigger than flour and squeaky shopping carts. "I'd like that," she said, her smile genuine for the first time in weeks, maybe months. And that's how it began, not as a grand sweep of romance but as small, tentative steps forward. Steps that would eventually lead Rachel and Matt toward a love born not of fairy tales, but of understanding, shared struggles, and dreams quietly but firmly built together. Building a home from ruins. Rachel and Matt moved into a tiny, run-down house on the outskirts of San Diego shortly after their simple wedding. Modesty didn't begin to describe it. It was barely a one-bedroom shack with faded yellow siding peeling away from the frame, a roof that creaked ominously in the wind, and windows so old they rattled even when the breeze was gentle. But to Rachel and Matt, it was the closest thing to a blank slate they'd ever been handed, a place they could make their own. It wasn't much, Rachel would later recall, her voice tinged with both nostalgia and pride. But it was ours. In a world that had always felt like it belonged to somebody else, that house gave me a tiny flicker of hope, a place we could call home, even if it was falling apart. Their first night in the house was a mix of exhaustion and strange exhilaration. They didn't have furniture beyond an old mattress inherited from Matt's cousin and a mismatched table they'd picked up from the curb. Rachel cooked their first meal, canned soup with a side of bread from the bakery where Matt sometimes worked part-time for a few extra dollars. They ate cross-legged on the hardwood floor, laughing about the shabby state of their new adventure. "This is going to get better," Matt said quietly, gripping Rachel's hand as they sat in the dim glow of a single lamp. "It might not happen overnight, but one day when we look back we'll see how far we climbed." And climb they did. Matt worked tirelessly as a construction laborer, waking up before sunrise each day, his hands calloused and blistered from hours of heavy lifting and hammering nails. When he wasn't on a job site, he'd pick up odd gigs, repairing fences, painting neighbors' garages, patching roofs for elderly folks in their neighborhood. There was no job too dirty or too dangerous for him. Rachel, meanwhile, picked up cleaning jobs around town, scrubbing floors and wiping down counters in large homes that bore no trace of the struggles she and Matt faced daily. Every night they'd collapse side by side in bed, too tired to talk but grateful to have made it through another day. One weekend, Matt brought home scraps of wood from a construction site. "These were heading to the dumpster," he told Rachel, his eyes twinkling with quiet determination. "But instead of letting them go to waste, I'm thinking, what if I use these to make shelves for the kitchen?" Rachel watched him work, sweaty and focused, as he sawed and sanded each piece of wood with a craftsman's care. By the end of the weekend, their crooked little kitchen now had a sturdy set of shelves that seemed to brighten the entire space. Rachel painted them a cheerful sky blue with leftover paint she'd found at a yard sale. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Matt's hands were always busy. When the roof began to leak in the living room, he patched it with spare shingles. When the wiring in the walls sparked ominously during storms, he borrowed tools and reconfigured the circuits himself. Their weekends became a series of do-it-yourself projects, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, their crumbling house started to transform into a home. Rachel joined in the work, planting a small vegetable garden in the patchy yard with seeds she'd bought for pennies. "I just wanted something to grow," she later explained. "I needed to prove to myself that life could flourish even in a place that started so barren." Tomatoes, bell peppers and zucchini sprouted up in no time, giving them fresh produce they could eat and even share with neighbors. A few potted flowers by the front door added color, making the house feel just a touch more alive. Their life still wasn't easy. There were days when Matt came home limping, his body battered from hauling heavy materials without proper safety precautions. There were nights when Rachel cried in silence, overwhelmed by how little money they had left after paying bills. Some mornings the pantry offered little more than rice and beans, and yet they always found a way to pull through. "I remember this one winter when the heater broke," Rachel said, recalling the struggle vividly. "We couldn't afford to fix it, so Matt and I piled on layers of clothes and wrapped ourselves in every blanket we could find. But what I'll never forget is the way he wrapped his arms around me and said, 'It's not the cold that matters, it's you and me against it.' And in that moment I believed him." The couple's bond only grew stronger through the adversity. Small joys punctuated their long days. A surprise cup of coffee Matt picked up for Rachel after work, Rachel leaving Matt's favorite cookies for him on the counter, the two of them spending a rare day off painting one of the rooms in the house together. Even the simplest gestures, sharing the last slice of bread or taking turns scrubbing the garage floor, felt like proof of their teamwork, a testament to their marriage. As the months turned into years, the once run-down house now had walls freshly painted in warm hues, a patched-up roof that held firm during storms, and a garden outside that thrived even in the dry California heat. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was theirs. Every creak of the floorboards, every nail in the wall told the story of their triumphs over each challenge they faced as a team. It wasn't just a house, Rachel said. It was a symbol of love, of struggle, of everything we believed in. It was proof that with enough determination, you could build something beautiful out of nothing. By the time their first child was born, a wide-eyed baby girl with a head full of dark hair, the house felt less like a project and more like a sanctuary. Matt built her crib out of reclaimed wood from the same scraps he'd used to make the shelves years before. Rachel hung handmade curtains in her room, and they spent countless evenings swaying their baby to sleep under the faint glow of soft fairy lights that Matt strung across the walls. This house, battered and imperfect, had transformed into a home filled with warmth. Rachel and Matt didn't just survive there. They thrived, not through luck or privilege, but through sheer determination, grit, and an unwavering belief in building something that lasted. It wasn't about the structure itself, but the love they poured into it that made it stand strong. The children. Hope amid hardships. Rachel gave birth to their first child, a baby girl with big, curious eyes and a wisp of dark hair one quiet summer morning. She was born in the modest bedroom of their little house, surrounded by nothing but love and necessity. There wasn't a fancy nursery or shiny new baby furniture, but what she lacked in material things, she gained tenfold in love. The moment Rachel held her daughter for the first time, something inside her shifted. Watching her tiny hands grasp Rachel's finger as if to say, "I'm here, I'm yours," filled Rachel with a sense of purpose and quiet determination she hadn't felt before. She was so small, so fragile, and yet I felt like the world was brighter just because she existed, Rachel would later recall. She was my reason to keep going. Childbirth wasn't easy for her, and neither was raising a baby with such limited means. Diapers were often made from old scrap fabric Rachel pieced together, and formula was an occasional luxury they couldn't often afford. Matt worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, but it was Rachel's creativity that worked miracles. She learned to make meals stretch. A pot of chicken soup would last days, its broth watered down to make just one more serving. Yet Rachel never complained. "As long as my daughter was full," she said, "I didn't care if I went to bed hungry." Rachel and Matt named her Elena, pulling from a name they had heard at church. It symbolized light. That light would only grow brighter. Elena's baby laughter filled the small house, her tiny giggles mingling with the creaks of old floorboards, and in times of exhaustion her smile was like a cure for everything Rachel and Matt faced. It didn't matter how hard the day had been, Rachel would say. One look at her little face and it was all worth it. Just as the family began to find their rhythm, barely staying afloat amid the weight of financial pressures, Rachel found out she was pregnant again. This time, panic bubbled in her chest. Each additional mouth to feed felt like an impossible mountain to climb, but Matt was resolute. "We'll get through it," he told her calmly. "We always do." Months later, their son William, whom they affectionately nicknamed Will, was born on a crisp autumn evening. Unlike Elena, who had arrived with a quiet but unmistakable spark, Will's energy was like a storm in Rachel's arms. He came into the world kicking and wailing, a spirited force that would give his parents more joy and sleepless nights than they ever imagined. "He was a handful from the start," Rachel joked, "but that boy had a fire in him, and we needed that fire to keep going." Raising two children on the thin threads of poverty wasn't just challenging, it was exhausting in ways that words couldn't describe. There were countless nights when Rachel stayed awake rocking Will back to sleep while keeping an ear out for Elena's soft cries. There were mornings when Matt returned home from a night shift with just enough time to grab a couple of hours of rest before heading out to another job. Life revolved around survival, but beneath the fatigue, there was an undercurrent of joy. "Elena and Will became the soul of that house," Rachel said. "It didn't matter that the roof leaked or that the kitchen floor was warped. We had laughter, we had family." Elena quickly grew into a nurturer, taking it upon herself to help her mother care for Will as soon as she could walk steadily. Rachel would catch her rubbing her baby brother's back when he cried, saying in her small, sweet voice, "It's okay, Will. Sissy's here." Watching their bond form was a reminder that despite all of the hardships, Rachel and Matt were building something worthwhile, a family that loved fiercely, even when the world outside seemed uncaring. Will, as rambunctious as he was, turned every moment into an adventure. "I remember one day he found an old pot I'd thrown out behind the house," Rachel laughed. "By the time I saw him, He'd turned it into a drum and was marching around the yard, leading Elena in a parade like a little commander. That moment stuck with her, not because it was particularly grand, but because it showed her how resourceful and spirited her children were, even in the face of scarcity. "We couldn't give them much," she said, "but they were happy with what they had, and that taught me something about resilience." Despite all the challenges of providing for their children, Rachel found herself renewed by their milestones: Elena's first words, Will's first steps, the way they both learned to fill the home with drawings and hand-me-down toys passed on by kind neighbors. The children were growing, thriving in ways that filled Rachel's heart with hope. Yet there were still sacrifices. Rachel skipped meals on harder weeks to ensure the kids always had enough, and Matt worked himself to the bone to avoid letting bills pile up too high. One particularly hard winter, just before Christmas, they couldn't afford gifts. Rachel sewed little dolls out of old fabric for Elena, and made a wooden truck for Will out of scrap wood Matt had rescued from work. On Christmas morning, she watched as they unwrapped these handmade treasures with wide eyes and delight, as though they'd been handed something far grander. "I learned in that moment," Rachel said, "that love goes a long way. The kids didn't care that we couldn't afford fancy presents. All they saw was what we gave them with our hands and our hearts." As the years passed, the children became Rachel and Matt's greatest pride. Elena was introspective, kind, and loved books, even the old tattered ones Rachel found at secondhand stores. Will, on the other hand, was the dreamer. He constantly talked about fixing things and making the world a little better with his hands. Watching them grow and explore their personalities gave Rachel and Matt a kind of hope they hadn't known they needed. The hope that the struggles they were enduring now would mean that their children wouldn't have to endure the same. "Our kids gave us purpose," Rachel said, her voice steady. "They didn't save us from hardship, but they gave the hardship meaning, and sometimes that's all you need to keep going." Sacrifice and resilience. Life for Rachel and Matt felt like a marathon that had no finish line. Each day brought new challenges, but they learned early on that survival meant sacrifice, and for their family, they were willing to give absolutely everything. Matt was the steady rock of the family. He woke up every day before sunrise and stepped into his steel-toed boots with a quiet kind of determination. As a construction laborer, his job was grueling, involving long hours under the unforgiving California sun, hauling heavy loads of concrete and wood. His hands were calloused, his back perpetually sore, and there were nights when he came home with dirt still clinging to his jeans and exhaustion in his bones, but he never once complained. "Gotta keep going," he'd always say, washing up at the sink while Rachel prepped a simple dinner of soup and bread. "This is just the climb, Rach. The top is out there somewhere. We'll get there." Rachel admired Matt's optimism, but she knew their climb felt endless. Where Matt provided the strength, she provided the glue that held everything together at home. From the moment she opened her eyes each morning, her day was a whirlwind of activity. She cooked meals, patched clothing, and cleaned the house with military precision, somehow making their sparse, shabby home feel warm and welcoming. On a good day, the pantry was stocked with enough rice, beans, and canned vegetables to scrape together simple meals for the family. On bad days, Rachel skipped her own dinner so that the kids could go to bed with full stomachs. But her sacrifices extended far beyond the home. Rachel also took on extra work as a seamstress, stitching curtains, mending clothes, and handcrafting garments for neighbors who couldn't afford store-bought items. She worked late into the night at a rickety sewing machine wedged into the corner of their living room, her fingers aching from hours of needlework. "It wasn't glamorous," Rachel later admitted, "but every stitch I made was another dollar for the kids. It was worth every sleepless night." What made it all harder was the relentless unpredictability of life. There were stretches when Matt's paychecks could barely cover rent, let alone utilities or groceries. One month their car broke down, a critical blow for a family that relied on every chance to save time and energy. Matt spent weeks walking to construction sites and back, sometimes hitchhiking when he was lucky enough to find a ride. "He never once cursed the situation," Rachel said. "He just rolled up his sleeves and kept pushing forward like he always did." That's not to say there weren't moments of doubt or breakdowns under the immense pressure. Rachel could still remember the night she found Matt sitting on the back steps of their house, his head in his hands. His shoulders, usually squared with determination, were slumped with a weariness she'd never seen before. "I took a job today," he had said quietly when Rachel sat beside him. "It's dangerous. Scaffolding work on a high-rise. Pays double, though. We need it before the hospital bills pile up." The hospital bills he referred to were for Will, who had fallen sick with a fever that refused to break for days. Rachel had rushed him to urgent care, but the visit left them drowning in medical expenses they weren't prepared for. As much as it scared her to think about Matt working at dangerous heights, she knew better than to argue. They couldn't afford to pass up opportunities. "I trust you," Rachel had whispered, taking his hand in hers. "But don't you dare leave me. You hear me? The kids need you. I need you." Matt squeezed her hand. "I'm not going anywhere. I made you a promise, Rach. This family's gonna make it. You'll see." They both leaned on that promise, during the hardest times. Their sacrifices weren't just acts of love, they became a kind of currency Rachel and Matt used to buy their future. No vacation days, no breaks, no luxuries. Those were the costs of resilience. Perhaps the most inspiring thing about Rachel and Matt's sacrifices was how they shielded the kids from the full weight of it all. Despite working 14-hour days, Matt somehow found time to take Will out to the yard on weekends to teach him how to fix things, a skill Matt believed would carry him far. Rachel, meanwhile, spent her evenings reading Elena old library books they checked out for free, tucking her little girl into bed with whispered encouragements about how smart and capable she could be. "We hid a lot of our struggles from them," Rachel later said, "not because we wanted to lie, but because we wanted them to feel safe, to see the world as a place that could be kind, even if it wasn't always kind to us." The sacrifices weren't always about money. Rachel and Matt gave up their own comforts, their own dreams, and even chunks of their own health to ensure that Elena and Will had every chance they could find. Matt's knees grew weaker from endless labor over the years, and Rachel developed chronic pain in her fingers from constant sewing, but they pressed on because their goals were clear and unwavering. One of the hardest sacrifices came when Elena expressed her desire to join her school's track team. The uniform and entry fees were expenses they hadn't counted on, and Rachel had to make the difficult decision to sell the locket her mother had given her years ago. It was one of the few sentimental possessions she owned, but in her mind, there was no question. "Things can be replaced," Rachel said firmly, when Matt hesitated about the idea. "Hope can't. Elena needs this." Watching their daughter beam with joy as she ran her first practice race made the decision worth it. "It's moments like that," Rachel said, "when you realize that sacrificing for the people you love doesn't feel like giving something up, it feels like investing in something greater than yourself." As Rachel and Matt looked around their tiny house and at their growing children, they knew what they had wasn't wealth by most people's standards. What they had, though, was enough: love, dedication, and the strength to keep moving forward no matter how steep the climb. Sacrifice is funny like that, Rachel would reflect years later. It feels like loss at first, but over time you realize it's what builds everything that truly matters. It's what makes you strong, and in the end, every small hard choice we made put us one step closer to the life we dreamed of. All for love. Tragedy strikes. Rachel could still remember the day as if it had been etched into her very soul. The phone call came just as she was preparing dinner, a simple meal of rice and beans that she had planned to stretch for the rest of the week. The house smelled of warming spices, and she had stepped away from the pot for just a moment to check on the kids playing in the yard. Elena was reading aloud, her soft, careful voice narrating a children's book to her brother Will, who was too preoccupied with a muddy patch of grass to sit still. The phone rang with a sharp urgency, a sound so mundane that Rachel had no reason to sense the storm it carried. "Mrs. Daniels?" the voice asked, firm yet apologetic. "We need you to come down to the site. There's been an accident." Rachel's stomach dropped, her hand instinctively clutching the countertop for support. She didn't need more details to know that her worst fear had come true. Matt, her steadfast partner, her rock, her entire foundation, had been working late that evening on a scaffolding crew, a dangerous job he had taken on to cover their mounting bills, and something had gone wrong. The drive to the construction site felt endless, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes away. Her heart thumped loudly and her hands trembled on the steering wheel as Elena and Will sat quietly in the back seat, still too young to understand the weight hanging in their mother's silence. Rachel whispered prayers in the car, her voice barely audible. "Please, God, let him be okay. Let it just be a broken arm or a twisted ankle. Anything but, just anything but." But when Rachel arrived, the look on the foreman's face said everything before he uttered a single word. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Daniels," he said, removing his hard hat and gripping it tightly in his calloused hands. Behind him, emergency lights blinked rhythmically against the fading twilight and the chaotic scene seemed frozen in devastating stillness. "There was an equipment failure. He fell from the 4th story. They did everything they could, but—" Rachel didn't hear the rest. Everything around her blurred into a vortex of soundless grief. Her knees buckled, and only the foreman's steady arms kept her from collapsing entirely to the ground. For a brief moment she couldn't breathe. Her chest felt as though it had caved in, a hollow space forming where her heart had once been. The man who had carried their family through every hardship, who had assured her with quiet confidence on even the hardest nights that they'd make it, was gone. Gone. The days that followed felt like an eternity of numbness. Rachel went through the motions of planning Matt's funeral because there was no other choice, not because she had the strength to do so. She quickly realized that tragedy had no sense of timing or mercy. The bills didn't stop coming, the kids still needed meals, and the world around her carried on as though her life hadn't just been shattered. The funeral itself was simple, like the life Matt had lived. Close friends and a handful of neighbors gathered at the small church the family attended on Sundays. The pastor spoke kindly about Matt's work ethic, his unwavering dedication to his family, and his quiet faith in a better future. Rachel sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, not daring to cry because if she let even one tear fall, she feared she wouldn't be able to stop. She focused instead on Elena and Will, who clung to her side, still unsure why Daddy hadn't come home that week, or why dozens of people were telling them how sorry they were. "Mommy," Will whispered during the burial at the cemetery, tugging on the hem of her frayed dress. "When is Daddy coming back?" Rachel's chest tightened, and she crouched down to meet her son's big, imploring eyes. "Daddy isn't coming back, sweetheart, but he's always going to be with us." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to smile for her children, even as her world fell apart. The weight of being a single mother pressed down on Rachel almost immediately. In addition to the emotional agony of losing Matt, she now had to bear the full financial and parental responsibility for their family, a task that felt insurmountable. The insurance payout from the accident was small and barely enough to cover the funeral and a few months' worth of expenses. It wasn't long before Rachel had to face the reality that she would need to do more, work harder, endure longer hours, and make sacrifices she never could have imagined. But how could she? The grief followed her everywhere, a constant ache that settled in her chest like a stone and wouldn't budge. Every corner of their small house reminded her of Matt, the blue shelves he had lovingly built for their kitchen, the hand-me-down tools still neatly placed in the garage, even the faint creak of the floorboards at night, as if they were waiting for him to come home. It was unbearable. Still, Rachel couldn't allow herself the luxury of breaking down. She had 2 children who depended on her, and she wasn't about to let them see her fall apart. Instead, she began each day with determination, even when her body felt too heavy to rise from bed. She found a second cleaning job in a wealthier neighborhood across town, picking up long shifts scrubbing marble floors and wiping down stainless steel appliances that gleamed in a way her own home never could. She often worked until her hands were raw and her back screamed with pain, but it didn't matter. "I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling," Rachel later recounted, "and wonder how I'd make it through the next day. But then I'd look over at Elena and Will asleep and so peaceful, and I knew I had to keep going, for them. That was the promise I made to Matt." There were nights when she felt Matt's absence so acutely it was like a physical wound. Will cried in his room, missing his father, and Rachel sat by his bed until he fell asleep, whispering stories about the man Matt had been, the games he would play with them in the yard, his warm laugh, and the way he always smelled faintly of sawdust and sweat. Elena, though quieter, grew more mature far too quickly, stepping in to help Rachel with chores and school pickups when she could see her mother was overwhelmed. Despite the darkness that enveloped them in those early months, Rachel began to find small flickers of light. A kind neighbor left a casserole on their porch the week after Matt's funeral. A teacher at Elena's school offered to tutor her for free when she started falling behind in math. It was as if the world, in its quiet, understated way, was reminding Rachel that she wasn't entirely alone. And as time went on, Rachel found herself drawing strength from the very pieces of Matt's legacy that had once felt like unbearable reminders of his absence. The shelves he had built for their kitchen now held the children's drawings and school projects, a testament to a father's love that would never fade. The tools in the garage became a source of inspiration for young Will, who began tinkering under Rachel's watchful eye, determined to fix things just like Dad used to. Rachel's life would never be the same without Matt, but she refused to let tragedy define the rest of their story. Where grief had left gaping holes, she began to fill them with love, resilience, and a determination to carry on, not just for herself, but for the family Matt had given everything to protect. The resilient single mother. Rachel's reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror didn't resemble the woman she once was. Her eyes were hollow from sleepless nights, and the corners of her mouth sagged slightly, worn down from learning how to swallow her grief and push forward. But beneath the tired exterior there was strength, raw and unpolished, forged from necessity, the kind of strength only single mothers know. Matt was no longer there to share the load, and Rachel could feel the world sitting heavy on her shoulders. She was on the only path left to her, carved out by sheer determination and a promise she had whispered to herself every lonely night. I will not let this family fall apart. Taking control of the chaos. Rachel worked 2 jobs now, along with any gig she could find to bring in extra income. By day, she cleaned houses in affluent suburbs, where the polished, manicured lives of the families she worked for stood in stark contrast to her frantic juggling act back home. By night, she worked at a local diner, a greasy spoon nestled in the heart of town, where the hum of coffee machines drowned out her aching feet. Tips were unpredictable, but the hours were steady, and Rachel learned how to read each customer like a book, whether they needed extra ketchup or a sympathetic ear. She scheduled her days with military precision. Breakfast at dawn for Elena and Will before rushing them off to school was always a hurried affair, her mind already racing a step ahead toward the challenges of the day. Afterward, she'd race to her morning job until exhaustion hit, glancing at the clock only when absolutely necessary. When the afternoon waned and her house-cleaning duties were finally done, she'd jet to the diner for the evening rush, wearing a spare uniform she found for half price at a thrift store. She often returned home well past sunset, her body screaming with fatigue. There were nights when the dishes piled up in the sink mocked her, but Rachel never minded. Instead, she would check on the kids first. She made a habit of watching them sleep for a moment, quieting the chaos in her mind while drawing hope from the gentle rise and fall of their small shoulders. I didn't have time to cry back then, Rachel once said. Tears felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. There was always one more shift to work, one more bill to pay, one more problem to solve. A mother's resilience. Rachel's resilience didn't just show up in the form of endless work. It appeared in how she parented her children with an unwavering love, even when she was barely holding herself together. Elena had inherited her father's calmness, but Rachel noticed how much of herself her daughter reflected too. A quiet, unspoken toughness that shone even at a young age. Rachel coached her through school projects and math tests, despite the sleep-deprived blur that filled her own mind. She made sure to attend every parent-teacher meeting, stubbornly refusing to let her financial struggles overshadow the importance of showing up. Will was a wilder force, a hurricane of energy that Rachel adored but often struggled to keep up with. He asked questions incessantly, about how cars worked, why the stars shone, why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. Rachel didn't always have the answers for him, especially that last one. But every time she knelt down to meet his curious eyes, she made sure he knew one thing. You can do anything, Will. Just because life's hard doesn't mean it cancels out your dreams. Their lives weren't perfect by far. Rachel seldom had time to sit down for family dinners, and the kids adjusted to eating leftovers reheated at random times of the night. Their family outings were low-budget affairs, long walks to the park, afternoons at the public library, but Rachel made them feel like adventures. She'd pack sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and they'd have picnics on the park benches, while Elena wrote in her notebook, or Will raced his toy cars along cracked sidewalks, fighting for the future. Bills never seemed to stop piling up, and eventually, Rachel knew she had to take a chance on herself to break free of perpetual financial strain. Though she hadn't pursued education since high school, she decided to enroll in a local community college's night courses. It wasn't easy. She carried a well of self-doubt alongside the burden of balancing work, parenting, and her studies. Some nights, she'd sit at the kitchen table long after the kids were asleep, squinting at her textbook in the dim glow of a single lamp. Will's toy truck would sit abandoned on the table beside her notes, a quiet reminder of why she was pushing herself so hard. The first day she passed a midterm, Rachel cried in the car on her lunch break, tears of pride, relief, and exhaustion all tangled together. Her instructor once complimented her determination. "You're one of the hardest working people in this room." Those words carried her through every late-night study session, every nerve-wracking exam. Rachel's ultimate goal was simple: to give her kids a chance at a better life. She saved bit by bit for their future, even if it meant denying herself small comforts like new shoes or warm coats in winter. "They come first," she would say, every time. Small victories, big impact. Rachel's resilience extended beyond her personal struggles. She found community too in the form of small kindnesses from her neighbors. One neighbor gave her old clothes for the kids. Another watched Elena and Will on rare nights when Rachel worked back-to-back shifts. In spite of their challenges, Rachel never forgot to pay forward those small gestures. When a new immigrant family needed help navigating their neighborhood, Rachel baked them cookies and offered advice. "I know what it's like to start over," she said simply. It wasn't only about surviving, it was about redefining what thriving could actually look like. Small victories became Rachel's fuel. The first time Will came home with a gold star for his science project. The day Elena drew a picture of their family and said, "See, Mommy, you're a superhero." Those moments reminded Rachel of everything she was working so hard to protect. Years later, when Rachel reflected on those impossible years of single motherhood, she spoke candidly. "People look at where we are now and think it was luck, but it wasn't," she said. "It was scraped knees, long nights, and sacrifice. It was working till my body hurt, but I kept going, because giving up was never an option for me." Unfailing love. The love Rachel had for her kids wasn't heroic, it was human in its flaws and sheer devotion. Those sacrifices weren't things they thanked her for as children, but eventually as they grew older, they began to see the depth of what she had done. "She was the reason we made it," Will would tell people later in life, his voice steady with admiration, "and she never let us see how much it cost her." Rachel didn't consider herself extraordinary. To her, she was just doing what a mother does. But as every sleepless night proved, her strength was extraordinary, woven into every moment she pushed forward for them. The children's earliest successes. The first tangible glimmers of Rachel's sacrifices paying off came when her children began to chase their dreams, turning the lessons of resilience and perseverance that they had absorbed from her into real accomplishments that brought her both pride and relief. There was a time when Rachel wasn't sure this moment would ever come, but standing in her modest kitchen, staring at the envelope in her hands, tears welled in her eyes. The letter bore her daughter's name, Elena Daniels, boldly written on the header of a university acceptance letter. For Rachel, it was more than just a piece of mail. It was proof of every sleepless night, every skipped meal, and every unpaid bill that had been worth it. She collapsed into her chair, hugging the letter to her chest like it was a lifeline. Elena's journey to academia. Elena was a quiet child growing up, but there was always an intensity to her, one that Rachel admired from the start. Whether it was reading under a blanket with a flashlight past her bedtime, writing poetry in her worn-out notebook, or conquering math homework challenges far beyond her grade level, Elena radiated focus and determination. Rachel often caught her sacrificing breaks at home or recess at school to study or take meticulous notes. "She's always been steady like her dad," Rachel would tell anyone who asked. "But she's got my fire when it matters." High school wasn't easy for Elena. She often felt like she was balancing on a tightrope, caught between her role as a big sister helping to care for Will and her dreams of a future bigger than the small house on the edge of San Diego. Rachel always encouraged her, even when their circumstances made it difficult. "You can be anything you want, baby girl," Rachel would tell her. "Dream big. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But dreaming big required more than words. It demanded hard work. Elena took on part-time jobs after school, tutoring younger students in science and math to help contribute to the family's finances. Even with the added responsibilities, she excelled academically. She joined the debate team, competed in statewide academic competitions, and took advanced placement classes while juggling everything else on her plate. There were nights when she'd stay up late studying by the dim glow of a second-hand lamp in their shared room, while Rachel quietly peeked in the door, beaming with pride. One day, Elena approached Rachel with a college application from a prestigious university in California. "I know it's a long shot, Mom," she admitted, biting her lip nervously. "But I have to try. They give scholarships, full ones. If they could just give me a chance." Rachel stopped her mid-sentence, placing both hands on Elena's shoulders. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, honey. Go for it. You're more than enough." Months later, when Elena received her acceptance letter for a full academic scholarship, Rachel could hardly breathe. "Mom!" Elena choked, thrusting the envelope into her mother's hands, her voice trembling with emotion. "They said yes. I'm going to college. I'm going to—" And here her voice cracked. "I'm going to make it." They clung to each other in the middle of the living room, both crying, not out of sadness but of triumph. Will's hands and heart. While Elena pursued academic excellence, Will took a vastly different path, one that perfectly suited his boundless energy and love of fixing things. From a young age, Will had been fascinated with mechanics. He'd spend hours in the garage, tinkering with his father's old tools, dismantling broken radios and rearranging the parts until they hummed back to life. Rachel marveled at his resourcefulness, how he could turn old scraps of metal and spare wires into something new. But Will's journey wasn't without its rough patches. Though he had a heart full of curiosity and determination, school was a challenge for him. Reading and writing were hurdles he struggled to leap over, and Rachel often worried about how he would find his footing in life. Teachers called regularly to voice concerns about his focus in class or his missing homework assignments, and Rachel spent many nights helping him catch up, often with Will fighting back frustration. "Not everyone's meant to sit at a desk all day," she reassured him. "You've got a way with your hands, Will, and that's a gift." When Will entered high school, Rachel pushed him to sign up for an automotive repair course at the local vocational school, hoping it would spark something in him. That decision ended up changing the trajectory of his life. Will fell in love with the shop floor, notebooks replaced by wrenches, pencils traded for torque wrenches. Working with engines came naturally to him, and even his teachers couldn't help but marvel at how quickly he picked up the trade. By his senior year, Will had placed first in the regional skills competition, earning an apprenticeship with a respected local mechanic. On the day he brought home his first paycheck, after months of working long nights in the garage and weekends at the shop, he handed it to Rachel. "It's yours, Mom, for all the times I couldn't give you anything." Rachel shook her head, tears streaming. "No, sweetheart, this is yours. You keep it and build your future." Pride swelled in Rachel's chest every time Will pulled into the driveway with a car he'd repaired himself or came home with stories about the people he helped. Will had carved out a path for himself, proving that resilience wasn't just something he inherited, it was built into his very foundation, a mother's reward. Elena and Will's successes weren't grand by the world's standards, but to Rachel, they were monumental. She saw pieces of herself and Matt in both of them, the fire to dream big and the patience to see hard work through. The moment Elena became the first in their family to step foot on a college campus was as significant as the day Will got his first promotion at the auto shop. Rachel, sitting in the audience at Elena's freshman orientation, and later in the bleachers at Will's certification ceremony, clapped until her hands ached, a wide smile refusing to leave her face. "They gave me purpose," Rachel would often say. "All those years, all those sacrifices, it was for moments like these." Looking back, looking forward. Years later, when Elena graduated college with honors, Rachel stood in the front row clutching a bouquet she'd stretched her budget to buy, and when Will eventually decided to open his own mechanic shop, Rachel was his first official customer, bringing in her old rattling family car. "What do you think of the name, Mom?" Will asked on the shop's opening day, pointing to the sign above the door. It read, "Daniels and Sons Mechanics." Rachel inhaled sharply, her chest filling with a mother's pride. She smiled, tears brimming her eyes. "Your dad would love it, honey. He'd be so proud." Her success wasn't measured in gold or luxury, but in the way her children carried themselves, confidently, passionately, and against all odds. Rachel often reflected on the long, exhausting journey that had brought them to this moment. The years of slogging through cleaning jobs, stretching dollars, pressing forward through heartbreak, it had all been worth it. "They're my legacy," she'd say quietly to herself, "and seeing them succeed is the one thing I'll never stop being grateful for." The lonely final years. When Elena and Will finally grew up and built lives of their own, Rachel returned to a life that had transformed achingly into something unfamiliar, a life that was hers alone. The once bustling house reverberated with silence. For decades, even the chaos had held meaning. The squeaking wheels of a toy truck, Elena's excited chatter after school, or Matt's boots hitting the floor in the evening had filled the small space with a warmth that overflowed. But now, everything was still, unsettlingly so. Sitting in her worn recliner by the window, Rachel often found herself staring down the quiet street, replaying memories of days long gone. Each creak of the floorboards felt like a ghost of the family she once had, of a life she had poured everything into. She could still hear Will giggling as a boy, banging on a pot like a parade drummer, or Elena reading on the sofa, her little legs tucked under her. But the echoes weren't comforting. They were reminders of how deeply time had betrayed her by moving on without her. Letting go but never ready. Rachel knew this phase of her life would come to pass eventually. She had raised her children to be strong and independent, to grab hold of their dreams and not let go, and they had done just that. Elena became a college graduate who now worked as an engineer on the East Coast, her calm determination driving her to success. Will was running his own mechanic shop just a few towns over, always full of energy and ideas. From the surface, Rachel's life looked like it had all gone according to plan. Her sacrifices had given her children the chance to succeed, to step into a life she had always wanted for them. The problem was, no one told Rachel how much it would hurt to no longer be needed. Elena called once or twice a week, but Rachel could tell even through the phone that her daughter's life was fast-paced and full of responsibilities. Their conversations were brief, often ending with a promise of, "I'll visit soon, Mom," though soon rarely came. Will, living closer, stopped by every few weeks, often bringing Rachel groceries or fixing small things around the house. He stayed for dinner sometimes, sitting at the same little kitchen table they'd shared for years, but even then, Rachel could feel the distance between them. Will's stories about work and the difficulties of running his shop sometimes had a sense of anticipation, as if he were already thinking about the tasks waiting for him after he left her house. Rachel would smile, nodding attentively during these visits, but when Will would glance at the clock and say, "I gotta get going," she'd always hesitate before standing up, her heart sinking. She'd walk him to the door, hug him, and watch him drive away, standing at the window until the glow of his taillights disappeared down the street. The loneliness rushed back in almost instantly, a tidal wave that left her breathless. Empty space, heavy memories. Rachel's days fell into an unchanging routine. Mornings were spent tending to her small vegetable garden in the backyard, a habit she had picked up from the days when every tomato and zucchini mattered to their meals. The garden no longer served a purpose beyond giving her something to do. Her afternoons were spent knitting or watching television, though she often found herself staring blankly at the screen without truly absorbing anything. Books sat dog-eared on her coffee table, more marked by intentions than progress, and her evenings crept in slowly, casting long shadows across the walls that once felt alive. The house itself seemed to mourn with her, each corner steeped in memories. In the kitchen, the shelves Matt had built stared down at her like silent witnesses, still painted that cheerful blue she had chosen decades before. Elena's old room remained mostly untouched, save for the moments Rachel would sit on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the faded quilt. Will's room was darker now, though Rachel had left some of his childhood toys on the shelf, unable to box them up. It was as if letting go of those small objects would unravel the connection she still felt to her children's younger selves. The ache went beyond loneliness. It was a paradoxical pain of emptiness mixed with fulfillment. Rachel had done what she had set out to do. She had loved her children fiercely, raised them with everything she had, and sent them into the world equipped to stand on their own. And while she wouldn't have done anything differently, Rachel started to realize that her sacrifice had, in a way, left her without an anchor of her own. Her identity for so many years had been entwined with her children, her husband, her family. Now, the quiet forced her to confront the hollow spaces within herself, occasional visits, and lingering guilt. The guilt that came with her feelings was as pervasive as the silence. After all, Rachel thought, she had taught her children to chase their ambitions, to focus on their dreams. She hadn't wanted them to feel obligated to stay and look after her, yet there was a selfish, unquenchable longing for their presence that she couldn't suppress. When Rachel's birthday rolled around one year, Elena flew in unexpectedly to surprise her. Elena brought a store-bought cake, along with a bouquet of fresh flowers and a handmade card that read, "To the strongest mom I know, thank you for everything. I love you." Rachel cried before she could even say hello, wrapping Elena in a hug so tight that all the years apart seemed to melt away for a brief moment. The day was filled with memories and laughter, but as the evening waned, Elena had to leave once again to catch her flight. Rachel returned to an empty house that now felt even quieter than it had before the visit. It wasn't her children's fault. They had their own lives to lead, and Rachel was proud of the people they'd become. But the moments when they left, those were the moments that broke her heart all over again, finding purpose in the quiet. As the years passed, the loneliness didn't disappear, but Rachel began to adapt. She volunteered at the local library, helping children with their reading. Their laughter reminded her of Will and Elena in their younger days. She joined a knitting circle, where other women her age gathered to share stories, recipes, and companionship. Though the friendships were not as deep as her bonds with her family, they helped to fill the hours that once stretched endlessly. Rachel also began journaling, something she hadn't done in decades. She wrote letters to Matt, in a sense, sharing her thoughts, regrets, and the milestones their children had reached that she wished he could have seen. "Elena would have made you so proud," she wrote on one page. "And Will, he's got your hands, Matt. Everything he fixes, he reminds me of you." In her later years, Rachel reflected on the complexity of her loneliness. It wasn't just the absence of her family that hurt. It was how time seemed to steal away parts of her identity. But gradually she recognized that her legacy wasn't diminished by her solitude. It lived on in the paths her children walked, in the lessons of resilience and love that she had woven into the fabric of their lives. Rachel's loneliness didn't entirely fade as she aged, but in time she found peace within it. Her life was never about riches or fame, it was about the family she had built and the love she had given, and in the end she found solace knowing that no silence, no empty chair at the dinner table, could erase the impact she had made on the people she loved most. The unexpected change. Rachel's life had settled into a rhythm, a quiet, lonely rhythm, filled with the predictable patterns of her final years. Her mornings were spent tending to her garden, afternoons volunteering at the library, and evenings knitting while reruns of old sitcoms played on the TV. For as long as she could remember, Rachel had lived day by day, counting dollars, pinching pennies, and stretching thin resources to their breaking point. Financial security was never something she could afford to dream of, but one ordinary afternoon, during a routine visit to the small grocery store in town, the course of her life took a turn no one could have predicted. Rachel stood in line clutching her modest basket of essentials, bread, milk, and a box of tea, calculating, as always, whether she'd have enough change left over for even the smallest indulgence. Something sweet, maybe. Something just for her. It was then that she caught sight of the brightly colored sign behind the counter. California State Lottery Jackpot $50 million. She scoffed quietly, thinking of how often people wasted their money chasing fantasies. But as she dug through her coin purse, counting the few nickels and dimes she had to spare, a tiny whisper of curiosity crept in. What would it feel like, she wondered, to spend $1 frivolously, with no thought to whether it was practical? For once in her life, Rachel allowed herself a moment of recklessness. She handed over a single crumpled bill from her purse and bought a lottery ticket. The cashier smiled as he slid the ticket across the counter. "Good luck," he said casually. Rachel smiled back, tucking the ticket into her bag without so much as a second thought. "What are the odds?" she mused to herself. She wasn't the kind of person who won things. Never had been, never would be. The miracle call. The ticket sat forgotten on Rachel's kitchen table for days, half buried under piles of old grocery receipts and to-do lists. It wasn't until a week later, as she sat knitting in her quiet living room, that a voice on the television snapped her attention away. "And the winning numbers for last week's $50 million jackpot are..." The announcer recited the numbers methodically, pausing for effect between each one. As Rachel glanced over at the ticket absent-mindedly, her knitting needles stilled in her hands. The first number matched, then the second, then the third. Rachel froze. Her pulse quickened in her chest. She whispered each number under her breath, comparing them to the ones printed on her ticket. It couldn't be. There had to be some mistake. "No," she murmured to herself, her hands trembling. "This doesn't happen to people like me." But it had. Every single number matched. All of them. For the first time in years, Rachel let out a loud, unrestrained laugh, a sound of disbelief, of exhilaration, of pure, unfiltered shock. She fumbled for the phone and dialed the hotline printed on the back of the ticket, her voice shaking as she confirmed the inconceivable truth. She had won. Rachel Daniels, a weary widow who'd spent her entire life struggling to make ends meet, was now the winner of a $50 million fortune, processing the unimaginable. In the days that followed, Rachel didn't know how to process the sudden, overwhelming shift in her reality. The once empty mailbox outside her home now overflowed with letters from banks, investment firms and charities, people and organizations that had somehow discovered her newfound wealth. Her phone rang nearly non-stop with unfamiliar numbers, each one eager to guide her through her next steps, or ask for a piece of what she now had. The tiny grocery store, once a place where no one bothered to give her a second glance, suddenly felt like a stage every time she walked in. People who had barely spoken to Rachel before now stopped her to offer congratulations, or thinly veiled requests for favors. Rachel felt as though she were living in another person's life. She had spent so many years in survival mode that she didn't know what it meant to feel secure, to have enough, or in this case, more than enough. One sleepless night, she sat at her kitchen table, the winning ticket resting beside her as she sipped her tea. 1,000 questions swirled in her mind. What would Matt say if he were here? What would he tell her to do? What would she do for Elena and Will? More than anything, Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She hadn't asked for this windfall, but now that it was hers, she wondered how to honor it in a way that reflected the values she and Matt had worked so hard to instill in their children: hard work, determination, resilience, sharing the wealth. Rachel's first priority was securing a future for her children and grandchildren. Though Elena and Will were no longer struggling, Rachel knew how unpredictable life could be and wanted to ensure they never had to endure what she and Matt had gone through. She arranged to pay off Elena's student loans in full and invested in Will's mechanic shop, allowing him to expand and hire more employees. She also created small trust funds for their children, setting aside enough money to help them chase their own dreams one day. When Rachel approached them to share the news, Elena and Will were stunned. "Mom, how did this even happen?" Elena asked, disbelief written all over her face. Rachel shrugged, her smile both humble and amused. "I guess luck finally decided I'd carried enough weight for one lifetime." Will chuckled, shaking his head. "Dad would have said you deserved it." Rachel's gaze softened. "I hope so. I hope I can use this to help you both build the kind of life he always wanted for us." But Rachel didn't stop at helping her family. She also revisited the struggling neighborhood where she'd spent so many difficult years as a young mother. She paid off overdue rent for neighbors on the brink of eviction, funded improvements at the local public school, and donated to organizations that supported single mothers and immigrant families, all causes close to her heart. A different kind of loneliness. Despite her outward generosity, Rachel couldn't shake a certain heaviness. Wealth hadn't erased her loneliness. The bustling house she had once dreamed of filling again was still empty, and the hours of her day stretched aimlessly, even as financial worries faded into the background. She moved to a modest but comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, indulging in small luxuries: a new recliner, a garden full of vibrant flowers, a trip to visit Elena on the East Coast, but she often felt disconnected. Wealth, as it turned out, could solve many problems, but it couldn't bring Matt back. It couldn't turn back the clock, making her children little again. Rachel caught herself longing for the days when her purpose had been as simple as tucking her kids into bed, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Reflecting on the journey. In the end, Rachel found peace by focusing not on the money itself, but on what it symbolized. A chance to give her children a foundation stronger than the one she had been given, a way to honor Matt's memory, and a means to leave the world just a little better than she had found it. Sitting in her garden one quiet afternoon, Rachel held a photo of Matt and smiled to herself. "We made it here, Matt," she whispered. "Not the way I ever imagined, but we made it." The lottery didn't define who Rachel was, nor did it erase the struggles she had endured, but in its own strange way, it gave her an opportunity to rewrite the final chapters of her life, not as a survivor but as someone who had finally been given the freedom to simply live. A wealthy but distant life. For the first time in her life, Rachel had choices. Real, tangible choices. The years of living paycheck to paycheck, pinching pennies to keep the lights on, were over. Her lottery win had catapulted her into a financial reality she never imagined, yet it didn't come with a guidebook on how to navigate such a drastic transformation. Rachel had spent decades, nearly her entire life, fighting to survive. Now, a quiet sense of anxiety settled over her as she realized she didn't know how to simply live. With time and careful thought, Rachel decided to move out of the tiny, worn-down house that had held so much of her family's history. It was a choice she wrestled with for weeks. That home had seen everything: her struggles with Matt, her children's first steps, their late-night homework sessions. To walk away from it felt like abandoning a piece of herself, but Rachel also knew that staying would hold her back, anchoring her too deeply in a past she was trying to move forward from. She eventually settled in a high-end retirement community in Florida, with quiet neighbors and lush green lawns that stretched as far as the eye could see. The house she moved into was modest for the wealthy neighborhood. A single-story cottage with bright windows and a garden Rachel fell in love with at first sight, adapting to a different world. At first, everything about her new surroundings felt surreal. Rachel was suddenly surrounded by people who weren't worrying about their next paycheck, people who spent leisurely mornings on golf courses or hosted brunches on their perfectly manicured patios. They chatted over wine about vacations in the Bahamas or ski trips to Aspen, sprinkling in complaints about how slow their luxury car dealerships were when servicing their vehicles. Rachel didn't feel resentment. These people weren't unkind, but it was as though they lived in another world entirely. Rachel often found herself listening at these gatherings, sipping a cup of tea rather than joining in the champagne toasts. She wasn't sure how to relate when her neighbors talked about things she didn't understand, like hedge funds and interior decorators. When they asked about her story, why she seemed to live so modestly despite her wealth, Rachel would simply smile and say, "Oh, I've always liked to keep things simple." If they pressed her further, she'd downplay her lottery win. "I got lucky," she'd say. "That's all, just a little luck for an old woman like me." But in truth, she knew her life wasn't defined by luck. It had been carved out by decades of hard work, heartbreak, and relentless grit. And that part of her, the part shaped by struggle, left her feeling like she didn't quite fit into her new surroundings. Distant connections. Though her finances were finally secure, Rachel's life didn't feel as full as she had hoped. Her wealth couldn't bridge the distance that had grown between her and her children over the years. Elena and Will had their own lives, their own families, and no amount of money could change the inevitable drift that seemed to occur when children became adults. It wasn't intentional or cruel, it was just life. Elena called her regularly, always sounding rushed but polite. Her job as an engineer had only gotten more demanding over the years. Her days filled with meetings, deadlines, and long hours. Sometimes Rachel could hear Elena's two young children playing in the background during their calls, their giggles bringing a fleeting joy to Rachel's heart. But the conversations were always quick, wrapping up with a familiar refrain, "I'll visit soon, Mom, I promise." That promise, however sincere, rarely came to fruition. Elena lived on the East Coast now, her family entrenched in their busy routines. Visits required plane tickets, planning, and precious time that always seemed to slip through their fingers. Rachel didn't blame her. She knew Elena was doing her best, balancing the weight of her career with the responsibilities of motherhood. Still, it stung sometimes to realize she had become a to-do on her daughter's mental checklist, something to fit in between soccer practice and business meetings. Will, on the other hand, stopped by semi-regularly. Living just a couple of hours away, his visits were more feasible, and Rachel always appreciated seeing him pull into the driveway of her cottage. He'd bring tools from his mechanic shop and tinker with small repairs around her house, tightening screws, checking the plumbing, fixing an oven knob that had broken off. He'd often stay for dinner, regaling Rachel with stories about his customers and staff. But even in these moments, Rachel noticed a certain restlessness in him, a sense that his thoughts were already moving on to the next task before the visit was over. "It's good to see you, Mom," he'd say, squeezing her hand before heading out the door. And Rachel would stand alone at her doorway, watching his car disappear down the street, wondering if it would be another month or two before she saw him again. In the silence of wealth. The emptiness of her home was magnified by the very things she had once yearned for, the spacious rooms, the luxury of not needing to count every penny. At night, Rachel would sit in her comfortable recliner, a blanket draped over her legs, and let the silence settle around her. It wasn't just loneliness she battled in those moments. It was the ghost of her old life. She missed the chaos of motherhood, the rush of making it through a day when the odds had always been stacked against her. She missed the sound of Matt's laughter echoing through their tiny old house. She missed the energy, the meaning that had once filled her days, even when life had been hard. Wealth, as Rachel had learned, didn't fill the spaces left behind by the people she loved. It didn't mend the gap between her and her children's busy lives, and most importantly, it didn't ease the longing she felt for the simplicity of her past, a simplicity steeped in love, struggle, and purpose. Finding new meaning, determined not to let herself spiral into despair, Rachel began to search for purpose again. She signed up for volunteer work at local schools, using her free time to tutor children in math and reading. Their laughter and uninhibited questions filled the quiet corners of her life, a reminder of the days when she'd helped Elena and Will with their homework. Rachel also started a small scholarship fund for students from underprivileged backgrounds, naming it after Matt. The Matthew Daniels Memorial Scholarship, the plaque read at the school office. Rachel hoped it would quietly honor the man who had worked tirelessly to build a better life for their family, even if he hadn't lived to see it. When life at the retirement village felt too isolating, Rachel made small efforts to connect with her neighbors. She joined their weekly card games, even though she barely understood the rules at first. She attended community book club meetings, contributing shyly but finding joy in being part of something, even if she still felt like an outsider at times. A quiet acceptance. Rachel's later years weren't perfect, but they were hers. She had come to terms with the realization that life didn't always look the way you thought it would, Not when you were 25 and dreaming of a bright future, not when you were 50 and fighting to survive, and certainly not when you were 80, sitting in a sunlit garden with more dollars to your name than you could have imagined, but fewer people to share them with than you'd hoped. On her quieter days, Rachel found peace in reflection. She didn't regret any of the sacrifices she had made for her family. In her heart, she knew she had given everything to ensure Elena and Will could live lives defined by choices rather than necessity, and for that she felt pride, a quiet pride that outweighed the loneliness. Wealth had given Rachel the freedom to live comfortably in her final years, but it hadn't been the answer to everything. What mattered most was the love she had given, the lessons she had passed down, and the moments she had shared with those she cared about most. As she sat in her garden one evening, the Florida breeze rustling the leaves around her, Rachel closed her eyes and let herself feel gratitude, for all of it. The struggles, the unexpected windfalls, the love, the loss. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but in its own way, it had been enough. Freedom and life lessons. In the calm of her later years, Rachel found herself reflecting on a word that had always seemed out of reach, a word that had teased her throughout a lifetime stitched together by hard work, sacrifices, and the pursuit of stability. That word was freedom. For much of her life, freedom wasn't even a consideration, not when bills stacked higher than her paycheck, not when empty pantries kept her awake at night, worried about how she'd feed her children the next day, not when grief from losing Matt wrapped itself around her chest like unyielding vines. Freedom was for other people, Rachel had once thought, luckier people. Not for communities of immigrants, not for mothers scraping by, and certainly not for widows who couldn't afford to dream about tomorrow. Yet, here she was, older and wiser, sitting amidst the life she had workshopped, molded, fought for. Freedom was finally hers. It came as unexpectedly as her lottery win and stayed in ways she hadn't imagined. But Rachel's journey wasn't about riches, vacations, or luxuries she'd never dared to consider growing up. For Rachel, freedom was about learning to live, to forgive herself for the years she had spent surviving instead of thriving, to embrace the lessons that had come from a life of tough roads and sharper turns, and most importantly, to see that every moment, every struggle, had built her into the woman she'd become, a woman at peace at last with who she was, choosing herself. Freedom, Rachel discovered, didn't just arrive in a single sweeping motion. It came in pieces, gentle whispers that spoke to her in the quiet moments of her day. It arrived when she looked out at her garden and realized she could plant flowers now instead of vegetables for survivability. When she got her first manicure at a small, welcoming salon and couldn't help but laugh to herself, thinking, why did I wait 70 years for this simple joy? It came when she ordered dessert at a restaurant unapologetically despite the fact that she was eating alone. In small acts, Rachel chose herself, not out of selfishness but as an acknowledgement of what she had given. She could balance these moments of joy with years of sacrifice in a way that felt almost poetic. Rachel began to break free from the guilt that had lingered so long in her chest, the guilt of thinking she wasn't allowed to focus on herself. She finally allowed herself to smile without reservation, to laugh without fear of judgment, and to live life on her own terms. She also no longer apologized for moving at her own pace. After years of living with urgency, getting kids out the door for school, racing through work for dinner shifts, stretching herself thin to provide, Rachel found an unfamiliar but welcome kind of joy in letting her mornings unfold slowly. She would sip her coffee by the window, staring at the garden as the sunlight spread across it, appreciating how light danced differently at each hour. The quiet felt different now. It wasn't something to fight against but to embrace. That was freedom. Reflecting on love and loss. At times, Rachel still felt the pangs of grief. Even decades after Matt's passing, she would find herself wishing for his presence in quiet, stolen moments of the day. She'd wonder what he would have thought about her newfound wealth, the comfortable home she lived in, and the children they had raised. "You'd tease me about all this, wouldn't you?" she'd muse aloud to his photo, which sat proudly on her mantel. "You'd probably tell me to loosen up and enjoy the ride." But as much as she missed him, Rachel had learned to build her life not around the void Matt left, but around the love he had given her. That love wasn't confined to their 10 short years together. It had spilled over into the way she approached the rest of her life. Matt's optimism and unwavering faith in their family had taught Rachel to see beauty even in the hardest days, and it was a lesson she now carried every day. Love doesn't leave, she'd often say. It changes form, but it stays. Matt's here in the way the kids laugh, in the way I see a project through to the end. He's always here, even when it feels like he's gone. Passing on the lessons. Rachel didn't see her role as a mother end when Elena and Will grew up and moved away. Instead, she saw it evolve. She began to craft her interactions with them less around caretaking and more about the wisdom she wanted to pass down, the kind of hard-earned lessons that had taken her a lifetime to learn. When Elena called stressed about balancing work and motherhood, Rachel would patiently remind her, "Baby, you're not going to get it all right every day, but good enough is more than enough. Don't forget to give yourself grace." When Will vented about challenges at his mechanic shop, a difficult client, a batch of bad parts, or issues with an employee, Rachel would remind him, "You've handled worse fires than this, son, and you came out better for it. You've got the tools inside you." These weren't just platitudes for Rachel, they were truths carved into her bones, truths she'd lived through. Knowing that her children could now glean strength from her experiences without bearing the same hardships gave her a profound sense of fulfillment. Her grandchildren became sources of joy and new lessons as well. She marveled at their unfiltered enthusiasm, their creative spirits. "Don't lose that," she told them whenever they visited her or when they'd send hand-drawn pictures in the mail. "The world will try to dull you sometimes, but don't let it. Keep dreaming big, like your mama and Uncle Will." Freedom in giving to Rachel, true freedom also came through giving. With her financial blessings, something she still thought of as surreal, she often sought ways to elevate those who had grown up in circumstances like hers. The scholarship she created for underprivileged students bore her late husband's name, not as a show of wealth but as a tribute to his legacy. "For kids like us," the scholarship description read, "don't let anyone tell you where your story has to end." She paid hospital bills for strangers in town when she spotted fundraisers at the local diner or noticed signs on community boards. She frequented the family-run grocery store that once felt like an indulgent place for her and made it a point to leave generous tips for the staff. "Wealth isn't just what you have," she'd say, "it's what you do with it." Rachel also found herself teaching her grandchildren about generosity. On visits, she'd take them to community centers, showing them how to pack food for struggling families or donate toys during the holidays. "You don't wait until you have extra to help someone," she told them. "You give what you can, even if it's just your time." The strength of simplicity. When asked about her significant winnings, Rachel always shrugged with a good-natured laugh. "It's funny," she said, "because the truest moments of joy in my life weren't about money. It was watching Elena walk across that graduation stage. It was Will bringing me his first paycheck. It was Matt looking at me like I was the center of his world even when we were flat broke. The simple things have always been the most meaningful." Her home, though not extravagant, reflected this philosophy. Filled with books, photographs of her family, and handmade crafts from her grandchildren, it felt far more like a legacy of love than a monument to wealth. Rachel realized that, to her, freedom wasn't about having everything, it was about needing less and appreciating more. A full circle of freedom. Sitting in her rocking chair on the back porch one quiet Florida afternoon, Rachel let the sun press warmly against her skin. Her garden, now blooming wildly with roses, hibiscus, and wildflowers, rustled softly in the breeze. She inhaled deeply, the salty tang of the nearby ocean carried on the wind, and smiled faintly. Rachel thought about the woman she had been all those years ago, the young widow raising 2 kids while battling impossible odds. That version of her had survived so much, and now, this version sat here, rested and grateful. Her journey had been one of profound struggle, but it had also been one of triumph and love. "All of it made me who I am," she whispered to herself, and in the end every bit of it was worth it. Rachel hadn't found freedom in wealth or material things. She had found it in the lessons she had lived, the lives she had shaped, and the peace she had finally allowed herself to embrace. Each chapter of her life, regardless of how difficult it had been, had woven into a tapestry she now looked at with pride, and that, she understood now, was the ultimate gift of freedom.